Hello everybody. The timer has started running, so I'm quickly going to start. I compiled a list of 30 Jenkins tips for you on all different levels, and I'm going to present those to you. One tip a minute. My name is Joep Weijers. I'm the build master at Topdesk. It's my job to let developers have the infrastructure to do their job. And as part of my job, I'm messing with Jenkins quite a lot. And I want to share some of those tips with you. So I also categorized tips in 3 levels. If you see this icon in the top right corner, it's meant for, well, the basic users, read-only users. They only go to Jenkins if a job fails, occasionally start a job, don't use Jenkins a lot. Then we also have the power users. They know their way around Jenkins and they are comfortably with creating their own jobs. And then we'll have the Jenkins masters, typically the Jenkins administrators, or the go-to guys who always know a plugin for your specific use case when you ask them. So here we go. Tip number 1. If you're going to set up Jenkins, use Docker. There are some repositories for Ubuntu that if you add the package list and make sure that Java is on your path, then you can install Jenkins using apt. Let's not do that. Just do a one-liner Docker command. And you can see I use a volume mount here. That is to persist all the job configurations in between the different Docker container runs. Keep an eye in the log when you execute this command, because there you will find the one-time password to log into your Jenkins. Tip number 2, use the Jenkins/Jenkins Docker images. There's also a library Jenkins in Docker Hub, and that's deprecated. The Jenkins/Jenkins repository provides weekly releases and long-term service releases. Tip number 3, there is a first-time installer, and it looks like this. First you need to unlock it with the password that we got in tip number 1. And the next screen you are presented is which plugins do you want to install? People have a lot of plugins in Jenkins, and in this case I would suggest to always choose the right option, because it will pre-select all the preferred plugins anyway, so then you have a chance to review them. I don't know how many of you are still running Apache and or are using Subversion. Well, those are some of the plugins that are suggested. Maybe you want to uncheck those. Now, this is manual work. We don't like manual work, so can we automate this? Yes, you can provision them. In the Docker image, there is an install plugins shell script. So you can run that, run this command on against a running container, and it will install the plugins for you. But you have to do a restart of Jenkins, and you do that by browsing to the Jenkins URL /safe restart. Some other options are here available as well that are less safe. Another alternative is to create your own Docker image based on the Jenkins plugin, and then you can provide a file containing all the plugins. So now you have a Jenkins master running, and by default all the jobs are scheduled on that master. And this is fine for experimentation. You can see we have 2 build executors here. But as soon as you're going to have multiple jobs, a lot of jobs, then this will no longer suffice. The Jenkins master is pretty busy serving the web interface to you. So if you're going to do a lot of big Maven builds next to it, then stuff will get slow. So pretty soon you'll find that you need to go to the nodes settings screen and add new nodes using SSH, or there is Java Web Start using the JNLP. And that requires port 50,000 to be open, for those who were wondering in the Docker command why I also opened up port 50,000. And new nodes, they will become available in this list. And you notice that there's also an architecture column here. You can use different operating systems for different nodes. So if you want to run your end-to-end test against Microsoft Edge, fine, take a Windows node. Tip number 6, adding these nodes in the GUI is a manual step. We don't want to do that. must be some automation for that, right? And there is. It's called the Swarm plugin. It's a little service that you run on your agents, and it will search the network for Jenkins masters and will automatically register itself to those Jenkins masters. I'm not going to go really deep into this, read the plugin documentation. Now there's still a manual step involved here, namely starting up this Swarm plugin service on your agent. Can we automate that? Of course we can, and I really suggest that you fully automate your agent provisioning. And you should also make them ephemeral. So the automating and the agent provisioning, that's going to save you a lot of time in the long run. When you're going to add more and more and more and more agents, you don't want to do that manually. And these agents can be Docker slaves that spin up on demand. You want that automatically. Or Ansible provisioned virtual machines. Fine, automate it. Make sure that if an agent goes down for whatever reason, that's the ephemeral part, make sure we can just throw it away and spin up a new one. That also helps you with scaling. Now we are done with the setup. We have a Jenkins running with several agents. Now I'm going to look at the jobs, and these are really the stuff that really works, does the heavy lifting for you. Tip number 1, don't use the Maven job. By default, you have a freestyle project available in Jenkins, and if you install the Maven plugin, you will get a Maven project as an option when you create a new job as well. And then again, if you can read it, they promise to drastically reduce the configuration. That's true, but they also drastically reduce flexibility. And they, well, I guess they add some kind of magic. They do things with hooks. Whenever a Maven project fails, it's pretty hard to reproduce locally, because it's really different what happens on Jenkins and what happens when you do a Maven run locally. So don't use this. Even better to use are pipelines. Pipelines are introduced last year with the coming of Jenkins 2.0, and it's Jenkins' take on job configuration as code. So a pipeline, it's another type of job. It orchestrates long-running activities. That means that you don't longer only do the build steps and the test steps, but you can also model your release and deployment steps in Jenkins. Now, a standard way to set this up is to have a Jenkins file in your repository, and that looks a bit like this. This is a Hello World Jenkins file, and it may have a lot of steps in there, but I'll get to those in the next tips. So for the pipelines, we also say do all the work on agents. And how do we do that? That's the second line. We have the agent directive. You can specify any or labels or, well, the exact choices. You should look them up in the documentation. But make sure that all the heavy work is done on agents, not on the master. Except when you're waiting for user input, that's a feature of the pipeline, you don't want to do that on an agent. This is how it looks like. And this will block the build that's in progress, which is what you want, because you want to wait for the user input. But it also blocks the executor that the job is running on. So if you have 5 executors and you have 5 pipelines waiting for user input, you can't do any new stuff. So this is the exception where we say run this part on the master. And you do that by specifying in your pipeline that you want to run it on the non-agent. That means run it on the master, on a little flyweight executor that's hidden from the GUI, but it's there. Now, of course, in any stage that actually does work, you have to say pick a suitable agent, please not the master. Except when you're in a stage that has user input and you really need to specify, do this on the master. Now let's talk about stages. Stages are logical groups of steps, so use them as such. here are some example stages from a build. And these stages, you can visualize them nicely in Jenkins in the pipeline. So the tip here is to use them, but also to keep the amount of stages small, and also their names, keep them, don't use very long names, else it won't fit on your screen, and you really want a nice overview in one screen. Tip number 13, don't mess with environment variables. What? Don't use environment variables? No, don't mess with them. In a pipeline, the $env environment variable is exposed. And this is fine to read from. But don't go messing around trying to override the path in this variable, because it's used globally in your pipeline. So stuff will break if you mess around with this. What are the alternatives? There is a with-env directive, and there you can specify, hey, for this next bit of code, provide these environment variables. So there you can use this to scope your environment variables as well. And there is a environment directive in the top level of the pipeline, and that will make the environment variable available in the entire pipeline. Parameters. You can use them in a pipeline as well. They're not really easy to use, but I'll give a quick bit of code to show how you use them. You define them, and in this case I read the value from the bar parameter and put it in an environment variable, so I can use it in my scripts. But the big downside of these parameters is it's an ordering problem. If I start a new build, by default it will have no parameters, so it will just start. It will read the changed Jenkins file. It will notice, hey, I need some parameters. I should have asked for them. And it will just continue the build. So you need to specify sensible defaults for your parameters, or the first build that you introduce them will fail. And when that has failed or has run successfully once, then the next time you hit build this pipeline, you'll get the interface for, hey, what are your parameters? What do you want to fill in here? So make sure to use sensible defaults when you introduce parameters. Parallelism is an important part in the pipelines as well. They really thought about that. And there are two ways of parallelism that I'm going to show you. The first one is to parallelize long-running tasks over different nodes. So, for example, if you have your end-to-end tests, typically they are slow, take a lot of time, starting up the entire application, Selenium, all that kind of stuff. And your performance tests, well, you also want to have those running for quite some time. Well, these are perfect candidates to execute in parallel. So you define it like this, and then as the extra tip, make sure that all the work within this parallel step is done in separate nodes as well, so you can really utilize the parallelism to also distribute the work amongst your nodes. Next up is, it's going to be a bit harder readable, but there's also a way, if you have a big Maven build, to parallelize Maven tests. There is a split tests function, and what it does, it will look at the previous run that has executed in your Maven build, and will look at the runtimes of the tests. And then it will try to put those in two chunks, in this case two, to make sure that the runtimes of those chunks are roughly equal. And then you have to do some fancy stuff to make sure that Maven gets the exclusions, so that it will only execute the tests that belong to the chunk that it runs, and this is then done in parallel. And this was even the full example. It just fits on a slide, and it's not really easy to use when you look at this, but it's a great functionality if you have a big, large monolith and still put that in a pipeline. Tip number 16. There are two different syntaxes of pipelines. One is called declarative and one is called scripted. Scripted was the first, well, basically the first attempt at pipelines. It was a bit more groovy-ish. Both are a groovy DSL, but the scripted requires you to program more, basically. And it also had a bit more boilerplate, so I wrote down some pros and cons here. And all in all, in my opinion, the declarative pipeline is perfect for the regular users. That's what you should first try to use. And the scripted pipeline gives you more flexibility for the power users. So I put the power users on both these sides. Typically, they'll start with a declarative pipeline, then run into something that's, we can't do that in declarative. I need scripted. And thankfully, you can put little chunks of scripted pipelines into your declarative pipeline. So that will help you here as well. You should also keep your pipelines small. And why is that? The pipelines are meant to be a orchestration tool. They are not meant to do heavy lifting. They are groovy DSLs, so you can really program a really big pipeline. We have one of 500 lines of groovy, and it's not that nice, but you'll quickly do some difficult tasks in Groovy that will hit the limits of the Groovy sandbox that Jenkins utilizes by default to prevent malicious code from executing on your server. So what is the alternative? Well, you should do all the heavy lifting steps. You should put them in shell scripts. And that has another advantage as well, namely you can test them out locally. A pipeline is really hard to test locally. Now we have another Jenkins master topic. This is also a bit harder topic. The non-CPS annotation. Inside a pipeline, to ensure robustness, everything is serializable. And this is done to store the intermediate state of every step in your pipeline. So that when a master or a agent goes down, you can resume your pipeline. And the developers of Jenkins use the continuation passing style programming paradigm here. Continuation passing means that instead of, when you call a method, instead that it returns its value, you pass a continuation to the method, and at the end of the method, it will call the continuation with the result as a parameter, sort of like callbacks. Now, there is a possibility that you have to use non-serializable classes in your pipeline. So here's an example. The Groovy streaming template engine, that's not serializable. But we do want to use it. So the option that you then have is to wrap it in a method and annotate that method with @non-CPS. This tells to the pipeline, hey, you don't have to persist this intermediate result. And as a result, it will not do that. So when the master fails, when it's busy with this calculation, it will just redo it again. But typically, that's not a problem. For the Groovy pros, I did not use a simple template engine. I used the streaming template engine. The simple template engine somehow, somewhere leaks a non-serializable variable that I wasn't able to capture, so it breaks the pipeline. Well, if a master goes down, sometimes the pipeline gets stuck. And it's a bit harder to stop the pipeline than stopping a regular job. A regular job would be stopped by hitting this little red cross. But if you do that on a stuck pipeline, you'll see this in the console. One of my colleagues tried to stop it 4 times, but it did not work, so I had to intervene. You have to, when you press that button, you have to go to the console and forcibly terminate the remaining running steps. And even kill the entire build if that still doesn't stop then. Well, we're getting there, 2/3 of the way. The Blue Ocean user interface. I guess most of you who've seen Jenkins think, well, that looks a bit dated. And you're right, I agree. and the folks of Jenkins also figured that. So they introduced a new user interface. It's still in active development, but a first release is done. So this is how your job overview looks. Now the pro or the power users will say, hey, that's not a fine list to look through. The overview, that's not for the pros, but more for the regular users. Now, if I click a pipeline, you also get a nice overview of the previous jobs that ran. And it looks pretty spiffy, but now it's the point where you should really get excited. This is the pipeline view. That's really a major improvement over the little square blocks that you had everywhere. So in this example pipeline, you can also see that the parallel steps are shown in parallel, and it really looks more modern. The Blue Ocean GUI also includes a pipeline editor for declarative pipelines. It has some requirements. So the credentials that you use to check out your Jenkins file, they should be write credentials. So you can also write any changes to the pipeline back to your versioning system. And when it writes it back, it will do some reordering, and you'll lose your comments. So those are the trade-offs. In a pipeline, should you be doing more with it than I suggested of keeping your pipeline small, then you may want to extract that code if it's used in several pipelines. For example, the annotated method, the non-CPS annotated method that I showed earlier, that was a piece of code that would show up in 10 or 20 pipelines at our company. And Jenkins also has a feature called shared libraries to pull that code out, put it in a shared library, and then you have one central place to manage it. So the adagio here is don't repeat yourself. These shared libraries can also contain files. So the example was about preparing a deployment YAML file for Kubernetes. Our shared library now contains a standard template that most of the jobs use. So also don't repeat yourself with regard to files. Views is a nice topic on its own, but you can build your own view with only the jobs that you are interested in. So you go to the My Views in the menu, and there you can add new views. And when you edit that view, you get the option to select which jobs you want to include. And there's some they also have regular expressions. So in this case, I want all jobs that start with project A. And the view will look something like this in the old GUI. Now, these views are really useful because I think that they can reduce the amount of emails that Jenkins sent. Emails are pretty easy to ignore, and we noticed that people ignore their emails, so builds don't get fixed. So we need another way to notify people that their build is failing. So we installed the Build Monitor plugin. The Build Monitor plugin will give you a new entry when you create a new view, and it looks like this. So you select your jobs, and it will give you a nice information radiator with all your jobs on it. And you can fit quite a lot of jobs in there, so I also took a live screenshot. It's pretty easy to get an overview. All the teams in our company have a big screen in their rooms with the Build Monitor on it. Jenkins also has an API. You browse to whichever page you like, and you just add /API on the end, and then you'll get a bit of documentation about the page and how to use the API. So an example is this call. The API is available in JSON or XML. You can, with the JSON API, you can filter which elements you want to get returned. So in this case, I query all the jobs, and I want to know their colors. And the colors in Jenkins represent the Yellow is it's an unstable build. Blue is that the build is green. The build is fine, it's finished. And the blue underscore anime, it's animated, so it's the blinking ball in Jenkins, which means the job is in progress. Why did I choose this example? Because you can also do some extreme feedback with Jenkins. One issue we noted with the build monitors was that people only look at them when they get up, go grab a coffee, which is regularly, but you don't get the instant notification that, hey, this build is failing. So I built something for that. So this little warning light, it makes a lot of sound because it's cheap, and it will notify people that, hey, something is going on the billboard, you should have a look. So I also want to talk about Cloudbees, the company that, well, basically they adopted Jenkins. They contribute a lot to the open source version of Jenkins, but they also provide enterprise features. That's how they get their money. They also created a certificate, so you can, if you really think that you have what it takes to become a Jenkins master, you can become a certified Jenkins engineer. So what are some of those features? They added some easy scalability for Jenkins masters. They have a Jenkins operations center where you can easily spin up new masters, new agents. There's also high availability. You get more fine-grained security options, for example, role-based access control. And they also added some extra monitoring, so you can get nice overviews of how the load is on your masters, so you know if you need to spin up new masters. You can probably do this all in the open source Jenkins as well, with loads of plugins, but Cloudbees has made it easy for you. Now, to wrap up in the last couple of minutes, I compile a small list of my favorite Jenkins plugins that I think everybody should have in their Jenkins environment. We already talked about the build monitor. The job config history plugin brings you versioning to your job configuration. So typically your pipeline is in version control, so that's versioned, but your freestyle job isn't. So with the job config history, it becomes versioned, so you can roll back if people screw up. Then there is a job DSL, a domain-specific language to automatically generate jobs. This is something that we use a lot with our end-to-end test jobs that are separate jobs for certain kinds of functionality. So we manage around 100 jobs with this. The throttle concurrent builds plugin will give you you can really fine-tune how you load your agents. Typically, it will just, if an agent has 5 executors, will run 5 builds there. Don't really regard if there's another agent that is doing nothing at the moment. So with the throttle concurrent builds, you can specify categories and make sure that the load is more nicely distributed. The timestamper plugin makes sure that all the console log lines are prefixed with a timestamp. And the version number plugin allows you to really tweak the version number in several ways. So for example, our main product, the versioning scheme is the year, dot the month, dot the build in this month. And the version number plugin provides us with that. And we team it up with the build name setter to make sure that you don't see just the build number, but you actually see which version was built in all the overviews. So these were my favorite plugins, and actually these were all 30 Jenkins features and plugins I would like to share with you. If you have any questions regarding Jenkins, the Stack Overflow Jenkins tag, it's pretty active. There are good quality answers there. You can contact me directly via Twitter. And we also compiled a lot of technical talk on our blog, techblog.topdesk.com. So that's it. Thank you very much.